Headline inflation in the UK is falling. It's also falling in the EU and US, which is good news. However, beyond the headline rate, underlying core inflation shows a less promising picture. Now, in the 90s and 2000s, we got used to low inflation with cheap food and manufactured goods. But the past few years suggest we can no longer take low inflation for granted. Increasingly, there's a risk of unexpected inflation shocks from climate change, geopolitical turmoil, and a decline in productivity. Research by the ECB found that global warming caused a direct impact on inflation and food inflation in particular. The record summer heat of 2022 contributed to inflation both in Europe and North Africa. In the US, Texas farmers abandoned 74% of their crops due to extreme heat. Higher temperatures and variable rainfall can lead to a loss of crops, a fall in the food supply, and higher prices. And it's not just disruption to food supplies. When drought causes lower water levels in the Panama Canal and the Rhine River, this feeds through into higher shipping costs. And it's not just about global warming. According to Morgan Stanley, climate disasters have cost North America £415 billion in the last 3 years, much of that due to wildfires and hurricanes, which appear to be increasing in frequency due to more variable weather patterns. Now, on its own, a 1% rise in inflation rates from global warming may not seem that concerning. But there are knock-on effects. The rise in raw food prices encourage firms to take advantage and increase their profit margins. Also, as food prices rise, it puts upward pressure on nominal wages as workers try to keep up with the cost of living. One reason the Bank of England inflation forecasts were often wrong in 2022 is because they underestimated how these temporary inflation shocks had secondary effects, with temporary inflation becoming embedded in domestic inflation. In the UK, nominal wage growth reached a record 8.2% last month, and this is very important for future inflation trends. High wage growth will lead to more nominal spending power and higher costs that firms will try to pass on to consumers. And the problem is that despite this record wage rises, workers have still lost out because of months of inflation being higher and falling real wages. So to catch up, the lost real wages will put upward pressure on wages for a considerable time. And this is why it's going to be difficult to reduce UK service sector and core inflation. Now, the recent decline in inflation in 2023 has been helped by a significant fall in oil and gas prices since last summer's peak. But the price of energy does remain volatile. Whilst there's continued geopolitical turmoil, there's always a risk that oil and gas prices could shoot back up. Since early June, oil prices have already risen 20%, and there are forecasts that this winter, oil and gas prices could rise. Last winter, Europe was relatively lucky that we had a relatively mild winter, meaning that the impact of losing Russian gas was much less than many feared. But a cold winter could see again rising gas and oil prices, which would create the new inflationary pressures just when we don't need them. Now, this year, inflation fell more slowly than many economists and the Bank of England predicted. The Oxford economist Simon Wren-Lewis wrote an interesting blog post early in the year about why he was wrong about inflation falling. Wren-Lewis, like myself, assumed that higher interest rates and a cost of living crisis would cause a slowdown in the UK economy and therefore lower inflation too. If you're going into a recession with pretty much zero growth, how can the economy be running too hot, causing inflation? But the problem is that the UK productivity growth is so low that despite anemic growth, it appears the economy is still facing inflationary pressures. And in the words of Wren-Lewis, if I'm being really honest, I didn't want to believe that things had become so bad. So the underperformance of the UK economy is contributing to higher inflation than you might expect at this stage of the economic cycle. And this is another cause for concern, that if productivity growth continues to remain slow, the economy is more vulnerable to inflationary pressures. Now, when we had productivity growth of, say, 2.5%, then it means that workers could get a 2.5% rise in real wages without any inflationary pressures. But when productivity is close to zero, any rise in real wages tends to be inflationary. So all these are reasons why inflation could be more of a problem than in previous decades. However, despite having said that, there are some signs to be more positive about future inflation. Firstly, the US experience has been encouraging so far. There's been a significant fall in inflation without a recessionary impact. Paul Krugman attributes this successful disinflation to the fact that inflation expectations were relatively low, at least compared to, say, the early 1980s. And when inflation expectations remain low, it becomes much easier to reduce inflation without a big cost to the economy. And also, there's a big difference between the US economy and the UK economy. US inflation is at least partly caused by the very strong economic growth, which the UK economy hasn't really had since COVID. Secondly, China, the world's largest exporter, is seeing deflation. So this will help reduce the price of manufactured goods. Despite people talking about reducing the reliance on China, the truth is that China still is a very big exporter of manufactured goods. Thirdly, although there is a fear of rising gas and oil prices this winter, so far in 2023, we have seen really very significant falls, and this will help keep inflation low for the next 12 months. Raw food prices have also been falling. So far, UK consumers have not really seen the benefit of this, with prices in shops still rising. But supermarkets are increasingly facing pressure to at least reduce food inflation, and future contracts should be with these lower raw food prices. Now, in fact, the Bank of England's own inflation forecast is that for the end of 2024, early 25, the UK could slip into deflation at negative inflation rate. And this is because of the magnitude of interest rate increases have really clobbered homeowners with higher mortgage costs, but also hit business owners with higher costs of borrowing too. And so next year, as more people are affected by higher rates, we will get weaker demand, rising costs, rising bankruptcy. Already we're seeing a rise in bankruptcies with Wilko, a high-profile casualty. The UK also saw an unexpected rise in unemployment this month, all the signs of a slowing economy. So as interest rates are increasingly felt next year, there will be downward pressure on spending and investment, leading to lower inflationary pressures. And so bizarrely, we could go from inflation to deflation in a fairly short time. Now, this might sound contradictory. How can we be talking about inflation threats and the prospect of deflation all in the same video? Well, the deflation would be the result of a slowing economy, weak demand, higher interest rates. The potential inflation threats come from external shocks, which give us the worst kind of inflation. Higher prices, but lower output at the same time. It gives the whole economy a worse trade-off, like we saw in 2022. Now, if the global economy slows this winter, then oil and gas prices probably won't rise too much. And so the most likely scenario is that inflation will keep falling in 2024 due to very weak economic growth. But even on top of this weak growth, there's always a risk of some kind of new inflationary shock from food inflation, rising oil prices, climate change, natural disasters. And the problem is that this will complicate the story, encourage central banks to keep interest rates higher than they should be for the state of the economy. When an economy is teetering on the brink of recession, like the UK, the last thing you want is 14 consecutive rises in interest rates. And so this is why the potential inflation shocks are so problematic. And it's not just about inflationary shocks. The impact of global warming can have a negative impact on economic growth and put pressure on government budgets. William Nordhaus's model predicts as temperatures rise, global output will fall. But this has been criticised for being too conservative, with recent weather events suggesting much bigger costs. Now, the final point on hidden inflation threats, what about the money supply? Because there was a huge surge in the money supply in 2020 due to quantitative easing. And this is starting to reverse itself. Now, the link between money supply and inflation deserves its own video because there's so many complicated factors. So I'll do that soon. So please do subscribe to get more videos on economics. And thanks for watching. Please give a thumbs up. See you soon.